This tank chat's going to be about this vehicle, the Italian medium tank. This particular example's the M14/41.
Please remember to like, subscribe or click the little notification bell if you don't want to miss out on these videos. And I'd just like to say thank you to all our patrons for making this possible. Please join them if you can.
Now, we've already had a look at one Italian vehicle and done a little bit about the background of Italy, its arms manufacture in World War II. But I think it's worth revisiting that because one of the big issues with Italian tanks, if you like tanks as a subject in general, we tend to have this idea that Italian tanks are crap, and to be honest, they're not particularly used very well, are they? So where does that myth come from and what's the issues behind that? So I want to just go back again. The Italians experiment with the tank in the First World War. They import an example of the French Schneider tank. They import some Renault FT tanks. They like the idea of the tank, even though their battlefront is mainly mountainous. And they actually go back to France and they want to order a sizable number of FT tanks to put into service. But the Italian losses at the Battle of Caporetto in 1917, the fact that the Germans attack on the Western Front in 1918 means basically France is not going to be in a position to supply those tanks. So Italy decides to build its own. Now, they do basically a copy of the Renault FT. That becomes the Fiat 3000 tank when it goes into Italian service. And the Italians actually, they order 1,400 of these. You know, it's a big old number at the time. But the war ends before any are actually made or any of them go into service with the Italian military. So the order is drastically cut to about 140. Now, they've also built a couple of examples during the First World War of a tank that then gets known as the Fiat 2000, and it's a bit like the A7V. It's a whopping great block on tracks, which is not particularly successful. But again, one of those tanks sees early use with the Italian military along with a couple of imported French FT tanks when just after the First World War, they're actually sent out to Libya to help fight against some rebellious tribesmen out there, so in one of the Italian colonies. So they do actually see a little bit of action, one of these ridiculously big Fiat 2000 tanks. Now, the King of Italy basically hands power to the fascist party and Mussolini in 1921. And Mussolini, part of the reasoning behind all this and why Italy goes to the right is there's a big disappointment in Italy because they don't gain the territory and the rewards they felt they ought to have gained by entering the Allied side in the First World War. And Italy, and one of these fundamental issues that's so important when we look at Italian tanks, is their strategic, but more importantly, their economic position. They are a relatively new country. They've only been formed in the 1870s. They are desperate to get to the top table in European power. They have a small industrial base, which is actually very, very limited when you compare it to the other countries in Europe at the time. And one of those points, just to illustrate that, I'm just going to read you some figures because to me, this is a really important one when we often compare the Italians with the Germans and the British as European powers, but there is a huge difference in their economic capacity. And to give you an idea, this is 1940. Population in Italy, 43 million, Britain, 47 million, Germany, 78 million. But in terms of production, coal, 4.4 million, Britain, 224 million, Germany 364 million, crude oil in Italy 0.1 million, Britain 11.9 million, etc., etc. Iron ore 1.2 million, Germany 29.5 million. Italy is on a completely different scale. It is so much smaller as a force in terms of its industrial might, and that knocks on its effect into what the Italian industry can make for their military. Now, Mussolini in the 20s, basically with his military, he's looking in much more of a defensive mode. In the 1930s, they're out to try and expand the colonial might of Italy and grab territory and those resources that are so important if they're going to build up their industrial base and in turn build up their military. Now, the problem with Mussolini and the fascist party, a bit like Germany at certain times, is it tends to be who you know. There is no firm long-term strategic aims. They tend to flip from pillar to post, and Mussolini is always attracted by what's going to be the best propaganda win for him. And in that case, he particularly likes his air force in the 1930s. He looks at the Navy as well. He's looking at the Navy trying to dominate the Mediterranean. The Army tends to come off third in all of this, so it doesn't get the same level of investment. And when Mussolini talks about the army, he comes out with this boast of 8 million bayonets. In other words, 8 million men he can put in the field, but actually there's those in the Italian military that are arguing against that. Why should we have 8 million men, very basic, marching on their feet, not motorised, etc., when in fact we should have a smaller army that can concentrate on becoming much more advanced, i.e. motorisation, tanks, etc. Now that argument goes on in the 30s. Basically Mussolini carries the day, even though within the Italian military there's some very forward-looking thought, how they're going to use what they call a rapid war type effect, using motorised vehicles. The truth is, even though they're coming up with the right theories, they're quite advanced in these ways, they don't have the backing of Mussolini and the industrial might to actually carry that out in any meaningful way. Now in 1929, Italy imports about 4 Mark VI Cardin Lloyd carriers, and these end up becoming the next generation tank for the Italians. They've still got those 100, 140 Fiat 3000 tanks in service, but they end up getting what for most countries we call a tankette. They enclose it, they put 2 machine guns on it, and it becomes a Carro Veloce 33 and then the 35 model later. And the Italians actually build a sizable number of those, so about 2,000 are actually built, and they actually get a good export model going as well. But that is not an effective, proper tank in the way we'd think about it. And this is exposed when in 1935 the Italians invade Ethiopia from surrounding Italian Somaliland and Eritrea. And even though they ultimately in 35-36 they defeat the Ethiopian forces and gain more territory, actually these little CV-33 tanks, there's a couple of occasions where they are defeated by the local army, which basically comes up behind them. They've only got forward-facing machine guns, the crews are killed and the vehicle's disabled that way. So the Italians are realising actually a turreted vehicle is quite important for them. Now back in Italy, there's Fiat, there's a company called Ansaldo, and Saldo have taken one of these CV-33 vehicles, put a hull on, put a turret on the top, and they're touting that in the open marketplace as a potential tank for sale. Now the Italian military don't actually go for that one until 1940. It goes through about 6 different models are advertised and shown around. Finally, in 1940, it goes into service as a light tank, the L6 tank, as a reconnaissance vehicle in the Italian army. But so they are deciding back in 1936, they want a brand new medium tank, not one that's available out there on the marketplace or is actually being built already in Italy. So a design process is started by Fiat, and in 1936 they're putting together their plans. 37, the first prototype vehicle is shown off, and that vehicle has the same running gear as the CV-33. It's got 6 of double bogeyed wheels on the side of it. It's going to have a 37mm gun in the hull, and it's going to have 2 8mm breeder machine guns in a turret. And that vehicle is looked at. Another model comes forward, another prototype in essence the following year in 1938. That is a model that gets approved. And this model has actually got 8 double bogies on the suspension system. It's got a 105 horsepower diesel engine in the back. And it's relatively well armoured. It's got about 30 millimetres of armour plate on it. Now, one of the issues we always hear about Italian tanks, they're not particularly well made, they're not that strong, or they're not well protected. One of those issues the Italians have is making armour plate, and their access to some of the minerals, some of the metals, to actually go into the mixes for making armour plate, and the skill sets available to then manipulate that armour plate means that, number one, most of their armour is relatively brittle. It's got a high sulphur content. In fact, in the Second World War, one of the issues that the British, when they're looking at Italian armour plate, one of the points they come out with is reports saying that this armour flakes so badly that the whole crew is usually killed when the armour is pierced, and a photograph showing a plate cracked extremely badly by a 2-pounder shot, it can only be concluded that the armour is of extremely poor quality. Now, that was a British report in 1941. The idea there, though, is that we know the reasons why. It's just basically they don't have access to the right minerals to actually make a stronger armour plate, and they are also using that armour plate. They are either bolting or riveting the armour plate. They don't have the welding technology yet in Italy to be able to actually fully weld an armoured vehicle as well. In many ways, they're not that uncommon. Many other countries in the later 1930s are doing similar things. So the armour is not necessarily that strong on that vehicle. Now, this vehicle, they order about 100 of these vehicles, but quite quickly, as it's starting to be built in 1939, the world situation gives the Italians another view of the tank, and they realise that actually putting a 37mm gun in a barbette in the hull is not the way to go. You really need a gun in a fully rotating turret. And in 1939, the Germans have invaded Poland. We've got the Pact of Steel. Hitler and Mussolini are now on very much the same page. Early in the 30s, they're a bit nervous of each other. They're now actually joined up in many ways, and the Germans brief the Italian military on their experiences in Poland. And this idea again about having an all-round firing turret, very important for the next generation Italian medium tank. So the actual production of the first model, the M1139, is curtailed to go for the next model, which is the M1340. And how you take apart these ways of defining Italian tanks, 1938, they have a real look at their whole military forces. They start a 5-year improvement program. They're going to have a new rifle. They're going to have different ways of doing things. They are looking very much more at this idea of the rapid attack, using motorised vehicles, etc. And they also redefine how they're going to talk about vehicles. So, for example, an M13/40 vehicle, it means basically medium tank is the M, 13 is the weight, 13 metric tons, and 40, for example, would be the year it comes into service. So the M1139 is actually taken over by the M13/40 with a new turret, with the main gun in that turret. And that ends up being the tank, the medium tank the Italians build the most of in the Second World War. About 710 of those are actually built. What does that tank have? It's got a 47mm gun now in the turret. The earlier 37mm gun was basically a Vickers copy. This is now a new anti-tank gun that has been brought into service as a towed anti-tank gun, first of all, by the Italian military. It's based on an Austrian design, and it's actually a very impressive anti-tank weapon. If you look in 1940, it's got more armour penetration power than, for example, the 37mm, the standard German anti-tank gun, just slightly less than the British 2-pounder firing armour-piercing, discarding sabot. So it's actually a good gun that they actually put into the tank. And that gun, in essence, is very effective against Allied vehicles. So we always think, again, these are rather puny, for some reason, Italian vehicles. It's only in about May of 1942, when tanks like the Grant start arriving in North Africa, that suddenly the armour, other than the Matilda II, is thick enough to stop the 47mm that's on these Italian medium tanks. Now, what else on those vehicles? the Italians decide to carry on improving, even though there are arguments in the early 1940s, should they build German Panzer IIIs and Panzer IV under license in Italy. Those negotiations go on for quite some time. And there's another element that comes into play that's to the detriment of the Italian military, which is Italian industry are still very much playing on who they know, rivalries and profiteering at times. So they are arguing, even though there's other tanks out there that might help improve the quality, the range, the abilities of the Italian military using armoured vehicles, actually it's people like Fiat and Ansaldo are convincing the Italian military, no, stick with us, we can do you something better. And so very quickly this tank comes along, which is the M14/41, which is, again, it's an improvement, it's an evolutionary thing. It's basically about the engines. Italy has a problem with its engines. It's got a limited agricultural manufacturer for the aircraft industry. That's why you'll often see Italian planes as triplanes, even quite late on the production runs, because they need three engines rather. They need those engines because they don't have enough power in one smaller engine. And that's another thing that the Italians go to the Germans to actually start building engines under license in Italy. Now, with the tank engines, the very first model has 105 horsepower, the next model 125 horsepower. This model then goes on to having 145 horsepower diesel engine in it, which is considerable. But relatively speaking, these Italian medium tanks are underpowered for their weight. Now, like a lot of the tanks at the time, they are being shipped when they're shipped, as most of them are, to North Africa to fight with the Italian forces there. They are having trouble with air filtration, the engines are jamming up, wear and tear. But the Italians, put it bluntly, are not alone with that. All the nations that go to North Africa with armour suffer those same problems. And these are trying to be remedied in these new improved models. So with the M1441, this particular model, it's now got newer air filters, it's got a mud channeling scraper on the front here to try and get stuff off before it ends up getting onto the tracks and wearing the tracks out that much quicker. They change smaller details to do with the stowage on some of these, but actually the armour protection goes up a small amount. You've now got 42 millimetres of armour on the front of the turret, 30 millimetres of armour on most of the plates, 20 millimetres on the side, 6 millimetres on the roof and the hull. So actually most of these models of the medium tanks that go into service with the military there are very similar. It's the engine that makes a big difference. With this M1441, you can see again some of those features. You can see the bolts that are holding the armour plate together. There is starting to get castings on the vehicle now. Here's now the two breeder 8mm machine guns. Instead of being in the turret, they are now on that barbette type arrangement. The main gun can depress 10 degrees or go up 20 degrees in elevation, full 360, and it actually carries 87 rounds inside. Normally they'd split it about 50-50 between high explosive, and again it was a good high explosive size round as opposed to the British 2-pounder that doesn't really have that ability, and armour piercing. A 4-man crew. The early medium tanks only had the 3-man crew. And overall, the ergonomics inside, they are not brilliant, but then again, no tank of this generation really is. But think of it as well, perhaps when you look at this, think in 1940, something like the Stuart tank that starts arriving in the Western Desert a little later. Actually, in terms of firepower, this has a better gun than the 37mm that's on the new American tank arriving. Armour protection is pretty good on the Stuart compared to this. Where the Stuart benefits, it's got about twice the horsepower compared to an Italian medium at the time. So again, that's where again the power to rate ratio on these is not that brilliant. And once they get the design of the suspension right on these vehicles, so this idea of the 4 sets of 8 double bogies here, that idea they use on all the medium tanks and their one heavy tank that they make later. The same track is also used. That means actually as the weight goes up, the ground pressure is quite high under this vehicle, but at least you have a commonality of parts and the factories are still making things rather than a complete redesign each time a new model of this vehicle comes out. And there's a further model that is put forward by Fiat for the Italian military, and that becomes the M14 42 model, and that ends up having a petrol engine for a change in, and it's got one or two, they change where the side hatch is and a couple of other minor details, a slightly longer 47mm gun as well. So with these vehicles, they are being used, they start getting into service in 1940. They're being used when Mussolini jumps in essence, to World War II, when he's seeing that France, Belgium has been defeated by the Germans. He wants a part of that sort of victory if he can. So again, with this rather unthought through way of doing things that Mussolini has, 10th of June 1940, he goes to war. Now, he has not got a fully equipped army yet. He hasn't gone through, you know, the Italian army saying about 1943 they should have done their re-equipment process. He's jumped the gun again. And one of the other problems he's got as well, he loses about a quarter of his merchant fleet because he hasn't warned them he's going to jump in the war, and about a quarter of that fleet is actually impounded. So his access to get these raw materials that Italian industry are going to need goes out the window very, very quickly, as well as the British naval blockade in the Mediterranean. And again, that's another thing to think about when we're thinking about these vehicles. There's not that many of them compared to the other nations. And again, this ability to improve them is limited because they don't necessarily have access to the resources that are going to mean that they can build that much better material. There's other elements that come into play as well with how they are led to perform. The Italians don't have enough petrol or ammunition to do the training regimes that most nations would be able to. And the other problem they have as well is they simply don't have domestically that large a motor industry. So it's something, it's absolutely teeny. It's something like about 10% compared to Britain and France. So with that, you haven't got that pool of trained drivers, trained mechanics to actually then use in the military. So if you read the accounts of the Italian armoured forces, they put together about 3 divisions that a lot of them, when they're turning up, this is the first experience those young tank men have of a mechanical vehicle like this, because they're not so used to it as some of the other nations are. Now, just coming to that performance of the Italian tanks that's led to this sort of reputation, they are probably no worse in terms of reliability than other tanks in service. Their armour protection is probably more brittle. There's no two ways that, you know, one's got to say that. Their firepower up till about mid-42 is on a par with the tanks it's fighting against. But why do we have this sort of reputation that they're either being ill-used or, dare I say the word, the crews are cowardly somehow? This is based on the 1940 campaign and British propaganda. Operation Compass, a huge army, about 300,000 men strong, is made by Mussolini to march into British Egypt from Libya, and it sits itself down despite the Commander-in-Chief's protests. They're saying, we are not equipped for this type of mobile warfare. We've got a few tanks with us, but not enough. Most people are on foot. That led to a very professional mobile British force under O'Connor completely trouncing this army, as its commander had expected. And the famous photographs of huge numbers of Italian prisoners, knocked out Italian vehicles, etc., that went around the world, and it became an obvious propaganda coup for Britain in the winter of 40-41, you know, when we desperately needed something in this country to buck up our spirits. So from that point of view, that vision of the Italian military tended to stick, even though subsequently, when armoured divisions were sent to North Africa to reinforce, their performance, actually, if you look at the actual stats, what battles they're involved in and how they're used, are actually much more impressive than perhaps we are led to believe. And of course, Rommel doesn't do the Italians any great help here, because when he turns up with the Deutsche Afrika Corps, takes command, he is also consistently disparaging of the Italians, sometimes obviously wrongly, because they become a very useful scapegoat. When sometimes his own forces don't do as well, he's happy to blame the Italians for what goes wrong. When in actual fact, again, look at the statistics, look at the battles, the Italian forces, they're not the best, but they certainly do a much more credible performance than perhaps they're given credit for. To the point that in one or two of the British, certainly New Zealand official histories, when in the Western Desert, our own forces are defeated by an enemy, sometimes if it's an Italian enemy, that's not mentioned, because it's still this idea that we don't lose to the Italians, do we? Because they're not the good ones, whereas losing to the Deutsche Afrika Corps. And similarly, in terms of how we look at this, why again that myth of Italian vehicles, it's been perpetrated in certain ways. Again, you only have to think about O'Connor's victory, 300,000 prisoners, that idea that that somehow is a stain on the Italian nation and its fighting ability. Think about it, actually that doesn't happen when the Germans surrender at Stalingrad, the British do at Singapore, or the Russians do at Kiev. So again, we need to pick apart some of these stories to have a closer look. So Italian tanks, perhaps not as bad as a reputation. They do certainly have their faults. They are not built in quantities or to a standard that perhaps other nations at the time are building them to, but that doesn't mean to say we shouldn't be respecting them, looking at them, and perhaps with fresher light nonetheless. And again, from our point of view, this particular tank was brought back to Britain for evaluation during the war. It was actually made in 1942. The report, again surprisingly, is much more respectful of this vehicle than you might imagine. They see actually this vehicle has qualities about it, design features that actually are worthy of respect. And even if we do believe these are lesser vehicles than those they were going up against, if we can give respect to British crews and American crews for going up against supposedly better quality German tanks in their own vehicles at the time, surely we've got to give that respect to the Italian crews as well.